Hello. Okay. You hear me? Oh. Yeah, you cannot hear me. Let me unmute you. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, yes, Stefan. Oh, you fell. Hello. Can you hear me correctly? Ah, great. Amazing. Super, super. We are the first one. Oh, online so people can know that we are already live. Voila.
Yes, you're making a social networking now, or?
Yes. So from now, firstly, I will remind in the groups that we are online, and yes, of course, you can start if you want to introduce yourself. That would be great.
Okay. So, do you want me to do it now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to join this session. I have been talking to you, Isabel, before on this Zoom because I'm writing a book called People Ambassador Dialogue Across Borders, and it's finished. The text is finished, but my son, who is going to an art school, is doing the graphic design, and he's doing it. And yesterday I had a very interesting Africa Day on Zoom, and I heard about situation in Tanzania and Burkina Faso. And then yesterday afternoon, I also heard about election to UN, United Nations Security Council, where Kenya and Djibouti was candidates. So I had a very interesting day yesterday, and I maybe would like to hear more about the African Union and the meaning of United Nations in Africa.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I see that your interest is growing in Africa. That's really nice to hear. Anyone else would like to introduce himself? Maybe Stefan? Let me unmute you. Up. So I'm not able to unmute you. I don't know why.
Do you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Great.
I'm the vice chairman of the Belt&Road Institute in Sweden, and we have been working. We had a very successful seminar in December on the question of the Belt&Road in Africa, which my colleague who is going to be speaking today, Hussein Askary, was present among other ambassadors from Africa, the ambassador in Sweden from Egypt, the ambassador from Ethiopia. So we are working very much to promote the importance of development in Africa, especially in light of the global development perspective of the Belt&Road.
Thank you so much for joining and also helping us to know more about the BRI, and especially for us, our generation, that we want really to be part of it and to know how we can also help to make it successful. So that's also the point of our event. So we are very, very happy to have you. And I can see that Mr. Askary is also here. Just join us.
Yeah, hello.
Welcome.
Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. We were just starting to have a little chat to know a bit about the people who joined the conversation until 7:45, and we will just jump into the event. I can see that Michelle, she was also one of the first to join us today.
Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Michelle.
Hello. Yes, I'm Michelle Rasmussen. I'm actually an American, but I am based in Copenhagen, where I'm the vice president of the Schiller Institute in Denmark. And the Schiller Institute internationally, since its inception in 1984, and before that, with the political movement of Lyndon LaRouche, starting from the middle of the 1960s, has been organizing for creating a new just world economic order where there will finally be economic development for the former colonial parts of the world. And now we have a big initiative for establishing a global health infrastructure to make sure that Africa and other places can be able to deal with this pandemic and make sure that there's general infrastructure for enabling economic development.
Thank you very much. We are very glad to have you as well, and thank you for inviting me last time for the Health Silk Road event, and it was very insightful, and also some of our community joined, and we were very happy to learn more about your initiative, and also globally what's happening in the world, like what every part of the world is experiencing and how we can relate to each other, so we can also find solutions together to overcome this pandemic. Thank you, Michelle. I can see that William is here. You want to say some words?
Good evening, everyone. I'm William D. Frazier. I'm from the U.S. I'm here based in Shanghai. Been here quite some time. I'm an entrepreneur, of course, by habit, by being forced into it, I guess. By living in China, you have to do business if you're going to survive in China. I'm glad to be a part of this meeting. I come from a different perspective. I'm actually from Georgia. If you're really following the COVID-19 incident in the U.S., I know they got some major states like New York has been really hit right now. I was just on a meeting the other day that their numbers are coming out of Georgia and Florida are skewed. And mainly it's affecting a lot of Black Americans in the U.S., even though the U.S. gives the perception that it's all in one, but it's not. It's not really that way. So I'm here to learn more about BRI and try to find ways to better engage Black Americans to get more involved in the BRI, as well as come up with some type of programs, some initiative that learn from others who have gone through these type of issues to better inform individuals back in the States that on a global scale, these are some communities or countries or individuals who are having great programs that we could consider implementing in our neighborhoods and in our community. Because as you know, it's all for one, and not all for one, but it's just like do for self in the U.S. I mean, there's really no leadership on how to combat COVID-19. The governors have to do their things. Then each locality have to do their things. So everybody's doing their own thing. So I'm trying to figure out a way to inform. I'm looking at ways to gather information to better inform individuals how they can better prepare themselves moving forward. And so I thank you for having me to speak, Isabella.
Thank you, William, and I'm happy to see you very often in our events, because we also do have entrepreneurship events and workshops every week, once a week. And we are happy to see the community coming together and trying to learn from each other, because also the speakers that we have in our entrepreneurship and workshops are as well from the community. So it's nice to see everyone here to learn more. So we also know where we can play our best part, right? Andrews, do you want to say some words? Oh, we cannot hear you, Andrews. Can you unmute?
Unmute.
Great.
Yes.
Now we can hear
I'm
you.
I'm also based in Denmark. I'm a participant of Schiller Institute in Denmark, and as well as a governing member of a newly founded African organization called African Diaspora Congress. I'm one of the governing members. Yes, so I'm very much interested in development of Africa and African issues. That's all.
Great, great. Thank you so much for being part of our event. So what about Amaury? I can see Amaury is here. You want to say some words? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay.
How about now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you guys here, all gathered about this belt&road and in Africa. I'm sorry, I kind of missed the introduction of the speaker, and I'd like to, if someone just, maybe you will have a little bit of.
You didn't miss anything. We are just having a little like networking before the event to start in few minutes. So we were just trying to know a bit about who is in the chat, and just some few words about you, about maybe what you do and why you are here. So it also can give good direction for us during the event.
Right. Okay. So my name is Amaury, and I'm from Burundi. Currently in my country because of this COVID-19. I live in Shanghai, and I actually met Isabel through this. It was this pitch organized by her. It was a Teranga Valley pitch, which was really a nice idea, and I really liked it. And ever since, I wanted just to be in touch and then get to know more about what we can contribute and how we can make ourselves, like how we can make this continent much, much better, in terms of business. So when it comes to this belt&road initiative, I think as it is introduced on that, like the introduction, I think it's really a nice initiative, and Africans should be able actually to have that win-win cooperation that, like they always say when it comes to belt&road initiative. So I think it is a nice way to connect China and Africa in every field of things that we need to create here in Africa, especially when it comes to business, or it could be like environment or anything. I think through that panel, we can get, we can create more and get really something. I mean, just get all the stuff working here through that belt&road initiative. So I'd like to invite whoever is hearing me right now to actually push each other and make sure that like Africans are aware of this belt&road initiative, because last time I checked, they're not really much about, there are not a lot of people that actually know. I mean, I'm talking about in my country as well. In my country, they don't know much about belt&road initiative, and I'm planning on telling everyone about the initiative since it's so new. It's been announced. They don't know about the forum that's been happening, the 60 billion that the Chinese government provided for Africa. They don't know that like we are part of it, but we don't know much more about these belt&road initiatives. So I myself would like to get to know more about it. So yeah.
Thank you, Amaury. And yeah, I want just to remind that you were one of the finalists of our AfriCelerate competition. We were very happy. AfriCelerate is just 4 people from Senegal, from South Africa, from China, and also 1 from Nigeria, that we reunited and we put all our resources together to organize a pitch competition for African startups or Africa-focused startups. And Amaury was one of the 7 finalists of the competition, and it was really a great experience, and very happy to have you and following up with your startup. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So I think we will slowly get to start. As you know, we are recording this event so that people, even if they jump in later, they still can catch up in our YouTube channel, for example, or for people in China, in our iQIYI channel. The goal is that we can learn every time from anywhere, even though maybe some people cannot come now, they will be able to watch it later, and it's also a good resource that we are creating for us to be able to learn always as we go. And I'm very glad to host today the 3rd BRI event that we had with Teranga Valley. The first one was 3 months ago with Zhu Ming and also Barak Bao. That were our 2 Chinese experts that explain us the frame of the BRI. Then, thanks to Mr. Askary, we had the chance to participate to the Health Silk Road. So we could also learn more about this part of the Belt and Road initiative. And today, I'm very glad to be in this subject of how to fully unlock Africa Island's potential, because that's why we're here. That's why we want to learn. That's why we all want to play a part in that. I think our community is very international. It's not only Africans, it's also people who want to help and contribute to the development of Africa. And we are very glad to reunite this community. Thank you, Mr. Askary. I met you through my research on the BRI, because at the base, I just wanted to find resources to help the community to know better BRI. And you are the first one that I met through my research, because I saw that you were doing so many things for the BRI. And I reached out to you, and without any hesitations, you invited me to your events and you accepted to be a part of this event today. So I am very, very grateful for that. You are the Southwest Asia coordinator for the Schiller Institute. You are also the board member of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and also the board member of China-Sweden Business Council. And I'm very glad today to hear more about how to fully unlock China, like through the relationship between China and Africa, the immense potential of Africa. So Mr. Askary, I'll let you now continue from here. Thank
you very much. I'm very, very happy to be with you. I'm honored to be with this, your organization, but also this great gathering of people from many continents. I see there are people from Africa, China, the United States, here in Europe, so I'm very happy. As you said, I'm the Southwest Asia coordinator, that's so-called Middle East. People know it as Middle East, for the Schiller Institute. And in recent years, I've become more and more interested in African development issues. But my relationship to the Belt and Road and the New Silk Road go very, very long back to the past century. When I joined the Schiller Institute, I was working with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, the late American economist, and Mrs. Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute. And I saw these fascinating, I joined in 1994, but already in 1995-96, the discussion in the Schiller Institute, also with other international organizations and governments, was about building the Eurasian land bridge, or the New Silk Road. So I was very happy to participate in the first ever report or book written about the New Silk Road. It's called it was published 1997, and it's called the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road, Locomotive for Worldwide Economic Development. And we had already then the map of how the Eurasia will look like. So this was the first ever comprehensive study of what is now called the Belt and Road, or the New Silk Road. So since that time, the Schiller Institute has held hundreds of conferences, seminars, written strategic papers, had dialogue with governments. Now, the irony was that the Schiller Institute was calling on Europe and the United States to initiate this project and go east through the development of Eastern Europe, Russia, and then Eurasia, and stretch a bridge to China and East Asia. Unfortunately, that never happened because Europe and the United States were busy building financial bubbles, not building railways and bridges. We also had series of so-called regime change wars in Iraq, my home country, and then later in Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. So it was a fantastic opportunity when the president of China in 2013 initiated the Belt and Road Initiative. And immediately Mrs. Helge Seppler said, now we have to run with this, take this and run with it. And she commissioned this other report, the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which is like a 270 page or I think 400 pages report, which covers every part of the planet, how it will develop. So I participated in writing the Southwest Asia part of this. I also translated the whole thing into Arabic and added to it, so it's 412 pages. All these books are available. And then in 2018, Mrs. Helge Seppler committed the second edition of the New Silk Road Becomes the World Language. This is a French copy. We have the originals in English. We have in German, and I think in Spanish. So this is a lifelong process for me. So this is a very, very personal thing for me. I've been involved. So, and also the book which I co-authored is this concerns Africa, specifically extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa. It's mostly about Africa's development. I'll put the link for the people in the chat if they want to order the book. So now the thing is, I can start my presentation if you allow me to share my PowerPoint.
Sure, it's already unlocked normally. You can share your screen.
Okay.
And I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions throughout this presentation and you want to write it in the chat, we will be able to address them later on. Thank you.
Okay, you see the first slide?
Yes.
Cover of the book, okay?
Yes.
Now I'm gonna be talking a lot in optimistic tone, but the picture is not very rosy, as people might realize in Africa for many different reasons. But as we see in this next slide, this is a contrast image. The one to the left is from 2015. It's a nighttime satellite image of Africa. And you can see most of Africa is in darkness compared, for example, to Europe. The other image is after I wrote the book on Africa, I asked a friend who's an artist, an animator, to give me an image of Africa in 2050 when all the projects we enlist and other projects of the African Union are built. So we got this image, which is not scientifically accurate, but it's an artistic image of how Africa would look like in 2050 if we manage to do the development we want to. Now, this image is inspired. I was inspired by a statement Mr. Lyndon LaRouche said some time ago. He wrote about it. He says it's the future which determines the present. it's not the past and present which determine the future, in a sense that the vision you have of the future will determine your actions today. And that's why it's so fascinating to see the Chinese working, because they're not working for the present. If you listen to the speeches of President Xi Jinping, he's talking about plans for 2049. Now, there are several plans: 2020, eliminating poverty; 2025, made in China. But China is looking at how China wants to look like in 2050. And based on that, China is working today. So they are not waiting to see how things develop to design their policies as we do here in Europe or in the United States, based on how much money we have. That's not really, money has nothing to do with these things. It's the vision of the people or the leadership of that people of where they want to go, which determines your behavior today. Now, as we see, as we understand now, we are in the middle of the Corona crisis. We have really, really terrible news coming out of Africa, both in terms of not being prepared for such a pandemic, as we have seen in earlier epidemics like the Ebola and so on. But it also has its reasons. We also have the combined terrible situation where, like the Food and Agriculture Organization was warning about, is that we might have also hunger spreading as a consequence of this. The World Labor Organization, the International Labor Organization, put out statistics of how many people in Africa, but also in the world, depend on daily work to get food to their families. In Africa, it's 86% people working in the informal economy. That means that people go out every day. Most of them don't even have an employment, but they have to go out and figure out how to get today's bread. And under lockdown, those people will be starving. So this is a really terrible situation. We have also the news of the locust, the plague in Africa, in East Africa mostly, like stretching all the way from Sudan to South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Uganda, and I guess maybe even Rwanda, Burundi, and the Eastern Congo, which is killing a lot of the agricultural land. Now, the reason is the reason Africa is not prepared is that, that we have lost almost 40, 50 years after African independence, where almost nothing was done. I put out this, it says this is statistics of the healthcare situation in Africa, where you can see how much, as a global standard, or there's an American standard based on a law called Hill-Burton standard, which it's like made it a law in the US after World War II that for each 1,000 people, you need to have 4 hospital beds. So you have to build a healthcare system where you have, for each 1,000 people, 4.5 or 4.2 beds. Now that has collapsed in the United States. Now it's 2.9 in the United States. But if you look at Africa, we have a really disastrous situation, and most of these beds in these countries are not really modern healthcare beds. So I also put here the electricity consumption, kilowatt hour per person per year, compared to Sweden. Here we have 13,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So this is anywhere close to what we have in the rest of the world. So this is the reason we put out the electricity consumption, because to have modern hospitals, you need electricity, you need clean water. I recently wrote an article which was published in Global Times on what are the requirements for Africa. Africa needs 15,000 hospitals built to come to the international modern standard. But that will require like 25,000 megawatts of power, billions of cubic meters of clean water, and so on and so forth. So this is the way we look at economics and economic development, as Mr. LaRouche has taught us. We look at the physical economic requirements of of these countries. So going back to the good news is that we now have a global initiative in the Belt and Road Initiative, and 138 nations have now joined. And as you see in the map we use, we are not saying that this is, it's not an exclusive. This is not a Chinese project. This is a global project. All nations can participate in this, and we believe, and based on the studies and the books I showed you, we can easily connect the Americas to Asia and also connect Africa and so on. So we can connect all the continents of the world with modern infrastructure if there is a system, a unified system for agreeing to finance and build these projects. Now, as I have discussed in last December here in Stockholm about the difference between the European attitude towards Africa and the Chinese attitude towards Africa. In Europe, we have this attitude there are famines, there are civil wars, there are epidemics, and only bad news on TV about Africa. There is nothing positive in Africa, but what we can help Africans, which takes us back to the colonial mentality, because helping is like this, the white man's burden has become. In contrast to that, the Chinese see Africa as an opportunity. And therefore, they think that they are looking into the future. They're not looking at what Africa has. Many people think that China is interested in the raw materials of Africa, and so on and so forth, which is partially true. But it's not legitimate to buy raw materials from Africa. But what China is looking for is to build a market and a trade partner, which is at the level of Europe and the United States, because China is too reliant right now on the United States and Europe as export markets and trade partners. So this is not a new idea. This idea was actually the president of the United States during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, had a similar idea, is that he told Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, that Africa needs to be developed with what he called American methods, with building infrastructure, sanitation, industry, and instead of sucking the blood of Africans to get pennies, you can get much, much more from a rich Africa, which a developed Africa. So, but that vision of Roosevelt was never realized. So what you do in Africa, what the Chinese were thinking, what Franklin Roosevelt was saying, is you have to empower Africa, because Africa lacks the tools, doesn't lack the natural resources and the manpower, but it lacks the tools to implement that potential. Now, there are problems with how both Europeans, but also many Africans perceive, economics or what wealth is about. Here I put together some covers of the British Economist, and you can see how the image of Africa is shifting from being the hopeless continent in 2000 to saying Africa is rising now, and then in 2013, they say the aspiring Africa. Now, this is a bit of a misleading characterization if you look at the motivations of the economists, because the economists look at all these ups and downs dependent on the prices of raw materials, what Africa can export and how much money Africa will get from these exports. That's what they base their statistic, their prognosis on, of how the future will look like in Africa. So this is a clear image of the ups and downs in the years described by the Economist, is when the food, metals, and crude oil collapse, then Africa is in trouble. When the prices go up, then Africa is rising. And this is a very tricky, a terrible way of running the economy. And unfortunately, I hear many Africans say, we don't need China, we don't need Europe, we don't need this and that. We have all the raw materials we want. We have the natural resources. Sorry, natural resources don't mean anything. It's a rock in the ground. Physical economics is about you can take that rock and grind it and turn it into a metal, and then turn that metal into a machine or a tool which we can use to grow food, you can produce goods, you can build hospitals, and so on. So you need something else than the raw materials, and you know, to get development. This is also shows how the African GDP in most sub-Saharan African countries changes with the change in the commodity prices. Today, we have a similar situation where the oil price has collapsed. You know, you can imagine what would happen to Nigeria and Angola and Algeria, who are dependent on export of oil and gas, but also other commodity prices. So you have to get into a new economic system where you get out of that trap. It's a trap where you are totally reliant on exporting raw materials or food to. Now I use this image on the European attitude towards Africa is you cannot get out of poverty by giving people money. You know, the reason China pulled out 800 million people out of poverty is not by asking the other 500 million to give $100 a year to the other 800 million people. This is not how you eliminate poverty. What the Chinese did is to build infrastructure, build industry, educate the poor people, get the rural areas into the economic development process, develop the agriculture, and so on and so forth. So this is how China pulled out people out of poverty. What the European so-called, like this project does, it makes poverty permanent, because you are not solving the core problem is that there is no infrastructure where these ladies, for example, can have water in their homes through pipelines and you know, other water administration system, but they have to go kilometers to go fetch the water. And then their daughters will do the same, their kids will do the same. And the same thing goes for electricity. So this is not you solve the problem of poverty and getting into development in Africa. This is an image of how the colonial African infrastructure looked like, which was to build a railway or a road from the mines or the plantations to the closest port for export out of Africa. Now, we very early on in the 70s, the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement, they said, you have to integrate Africa by building an infrastructure system to connect all African nations. Now, there was a study, it's a fact now today that 13% of African trade is among African nations. The rest, the 87%, is African countries having trade with other continents. So like between Egypt and Sudan, who are neighbors, the trade between the two is 1.5%, while they are having trade with the rest of the world for 98.5%. And this is a disaster, because you have areas in Africa where you can have specific agricultural products, raw materials, skills, and so on, which can be useful in other parts of Africa. And according to a study which was done by the World Bank, you know, the World Bank are very good at doing studies, but they never build anything. Like this study done by German experts, it shows that only to rehabilitate the existing road system among sub-Saharan African countries, you can increase the trade between those countries by between 1,000 and 500%, only by upgrading the existing roads or building just simple roads. Now, imagine what you can do with modern railways, highways, and so on for trade among African nations. Now, we have a fantastic agreement among African nations for creating the African free trade area, where all the customs, all the other hindrances for the trade are removed among African countries. The problem is that you cannot transport goods among African countries. Even if you want to fly from Ethiopia to Nigeria, you have to fly to Frankfurt, to Paris, or London, and then fly back to Nigeria. There's no way you can go directly from one African country to the other. Now, there's a lot of disinformation on what China is doing in Africa, why the African leaders like China and so on. This is from the Forum on Africa, on the China-Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC in 2018. This was in early September, and almost all African leaders were there. 2 weeks later at the UN General Assembly, only half of the African leaders went to New York. Because as the Ugandan president said, you know, when we go to these countries, to conferences in the West, we get lectured on human rights and democracy, and we get nothing in terms of development. But when we go to China, you get discussions about how to work together to build the economy, develop trade, and so on. So there's a reason why China is attractive for African nations, and it should be. And that does not exclude Europe and the United States. We have been the whole time saying the United States and Europe should join into this effort to develop Africa. So the China, in African eyes, they have successfully eliminated poverty. This year, 2020, there will be no more poor people or below the poverty line. They managed that in like 20, 30 years. Remember, China was much, much poorer than most African countries in the late 1960s. If you go back to statistics, China is succeeding in sustaining its development. Its sustainable development means different things in China than in the West. I have written about that. It means to sustain the development of living conditions of people at higher and higher quality. China managed to get industrial development. It's one of the most advanced industrial countries. And China, of course, has no strings attached to its work with Africa. Now, this does not mean that this is aid to Africa. China is the biggest aid donor to Africa, but this is not aid. This is economic cooperation. A lot of it is direct investment into Africa. So the Chinese, I know that this is not a so-called Marshall Plan or trying to help African countries. This is to build strong economic partners. And the way the Chinese see it, this is how Africans also understand what development is about. And the Chinese president in the FOCAC summit in Johannesburg in South Africa, 2015, he said industrialization is an inevitable path to a country's economic success. And then he discussed how China managed to do that. And he says that it's completely possible for Africa to do what China done as a developing nation. And he also talked about the possibilities, the potentials that exist for Africa. You know, when I showed the first image of Africa in 2050, we'll have about 3 billion people living in Africa. Africa is 3 times larger than China in area, but it's almost unpopulated. Now, people in Europe and other countries, they think Africa is overpopulated. Africa is underpopulated in reality, if you look at other parts of the world. So the Chinese managed to, in one of the speeches of President Xi Jinping, he said there are 3 bottlenecks of development in Africa. The first is the shortage of capital. The second is the shortage of skilled labor. The third is the lack of infrastructure. And that's exactly correct diagnosis of what the problem in Africa is. So in terms of the lack of capital, China is providing credit, long-term credit to the African nations. Now, there's a lot of talk about so-called debt trap. I'm not going to discuss it in my presentation, but I can answer questions about it. So China is mostly doing foreign direct investment in Africa. Some projects are financed through loans. So African nations have been stripped for 30, 40 years of the ability to generate credit. They are not allowed to generate credit, and they are not getting long-term credit for investment in infrastructure from Europe or the United States. Most of the European and American investments in Africa is in raw materials. It's never in building large-scale infrastructure. So China pledged 60 billion between 2015 and 2018. It has pledged 60 billion now until 2020. So in terms of the lack of skilled labor, China is also becoming a major destination for Africans to study in China. China just last year surpassed both the Britain and the United States in the number of African students studying in China. Only France still has more African students studying in France more than any other country, and we know the background to that. But the Chinese also try to train Africans who will be involved in building and running the infrastructure. Like this image is these are the ladies who are now running the Mombasa-Nairobi railway. They were educated in China. One of them even speaks Chinese. And then they go back and they run the things. There are lots of mythology about Chinese taking their own workers, their own food, their own stuff, and they don't employ Africans or local people. That's not true. There are studies which I include in my book that most of the labor is African. Almost half of the management is African. Almost 30–40% of the engineering workers are African. So it's not like a Chinese colonization process. Now, lack of infrastructure. That's the real issue here, which is very seldom discussed when you talk about African development. They say there are problems with equality, there is corruption, there is dictatorships, there is this and that. And, you know, before you talk about these things, you have to figure out how to build the basic physical infrastructure in any country you want. And just to remind everyone, I'm not talking, these are not Chinese projects. All the projects China is building, almost all of them, these are African ideas. Like this map of the Trans-African highways, this was part of the Lagos plan in 1982, but nothing was done about it. So the Chinese, when the Prime Minister Li Keqiang went to East Africa in 2014, and then went to West Africa, he said, we can help connect all the major African capitals with high-speed rail and modern railways. And then they started immediately to work with African nations on these projects. So these are African projects. They were designed by African leaders, and it's for the service of the African people. Now, China comes in and says, look, we know how to do these things. We can also finance it if there's a problem. So in just 3 years, we had the Djibouti-Addis Ababa railway built, which was a big boost for the Ethiopian economy. And just remind you again, this is part of the Ethiopian National Development Plan. They have 5-year plans, and these are designed by the Ethiopian government, not by China. And they also have the design for 8 industrial cities, industrial zones, which China is investing in. So Ethiopia is industrializing very rapidly. They're also building large-scale hydropower to electrify the industrial process. You cannot have industrial development and infrastructure without electricity. So at the same time, we had the Mombasa Nairobi railway built just in 3 years, all record time. We have all the plans for connecting the East African nations. These are part of the East African Master Rail Plan. It also has been on the tables for decades. They were never built. Now China is building it. We had the Tanzania, Zambia, Angola railway also was built in record time or refurbished. We also have their ideas to connect all the rivers and Great Lakes of Africa with a river navigation system. The Egyptian government presented a plan in 2018 to do something for the Nile rivers. But I really believe, and we have discussions with African engineers, it's quite possible to connect all the rivers and lakes of Africa for navigation, for transport. In that similar manner that Europe managed to do that. They're connecting the Black Sea to the Atlantic Sea or to the North Sea through the Danube Rhine system. So this is very, very important for the trans-African trade, we have one of the major projects we have been working on the Schiller Institute, lobbying for it in Europe and the United States. It's what we call the TransAqua project. Now, the TransAqua project it was designed by an Italian company, Bonifica, and the engineer, we have had good collaboration, Dr. Marcello Vichi. Already in the 70s, he presented the plan to transfer a small portion of the water of the Congo River to the Chari River in Central African Republic and Chad, to refill the Lake Chad, which has been drying up. It's only 10% of its previous size, which was in the early 60s. And millions of people live off the water of the Lake Chad for fishing, grazing, having cattle, and some agriculture. So it's quite possible to do this project, but it's going to take a huge investment. And the Schiller Institute have managed actually to get the Lake Chad Commission to start discussions with the Chinese companies and Italian companies. And now there's agreement to start working on a feasibility study. All the problems are not solved because some people in the Congo think that somebody is there to steal their water, which is not true. This will benefit the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, more than any other country because of all the transport and hydropower projects. This is how the project will transfer a portion of the water in the yellow zone in the upper lands from the tributaries of the Congo and lead it through this 2,000-kilometer canal, which can be used for navigation all the way to the Central African Republic and to Chad, and create also hydropower plants along the way, and also industrial zones, ports, and create agricultural zones. Another major project which we have been discussing, you remember I was talking about building 15,000 hospitals in Africa. You would need additional 25,000 megawatts of power. This is an image of the Grand Inga Dam project in the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. It has the potential only in this area to generate 40,000 megawatts of power. This is twice as much as the Chinese Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. Now, the whole Congo River has the potential, if you build a series of dams along the whole river, of 100,000 megawatts of power. This would be a revolution in electrifying all the African continent. Only this river, and now you have lots of other potentials which are not used. So all these things have been dormant, sleeping, all these projects, which African nations, only now they are being considered, and a Chinese company, Sino Hydro, and a Spanish company got together last year, agreed to work together to build the first 11,000 megawatts of power. So this is a promising prospect, and other nations should participate in it. We have, and people get shocked when we talk about the importance of building nuclear power in Africa. Now there's a lot of hypocrisy here in the West where they say we should stop the Chinese from building coal power in Africa. And they finance a lot of movements, so-called civil society movements, to protest against Chinese coal power. At the same time, Europe and the United States are against both hydropower and nuclear power for Africa. So how can you develop Africa without electricity? Well, they say, well, we can have renewables, solar power, and wind power, but that everybody knows. You cannot have a modern economy based on solar power and wind power. That's an impossibility, physical impossibility. It's not scientific. So in South Africa, we had potential that there will be new technologies. This is like a German technology for safe nuclear, high temperature nuclear reactor. We have many African countries now, they have plans to build nuclear power. And Russia, last year, the President Putin in the summit in Sochi with the African leaders, he said Russia is willing to work with all African countries to electrify Africa using nuclear power. And this is the first commercial nuclear power will be built in Egypt, in the west of Egypt, Al-Daba. And what's fascinating is that they built a school to educate young people, high school kids, as nuclear technicians. So each year you will have like 200 to 300 new students studying nuclear technology, because they want both to use them to manage the nuclear power plants which will be built for reactors in that area, but also to create an elite of nuclear scientists and technicians in Egypt who will then be useful for all of Africa. So this is how this Egyptian nuclear power plant will look like. This is the exact model of it. And now Russia has agreements with all these countries in Africa, and China has only with a few. Now, nuclear technology is not simply power generation. It has many, many scientific implications, technological implications for healthcare, for metals, for agriculture, lots of applications of nuclear power. You cannot have that with solar and wind power. You don't have scientific. Another thing which African nations, many African nations, and we know individual researchers who are also calling for having African Space Agency, where the youth will be inspired by looking at the stars, to have this level of ambition for African children, students, to reach these levels of technological and scientific development. All this is quite possible. It's not as I said, the Chinese managed that in 30 years. They had an idea, they had a plan, they worked on it. Now they have a plan for the next 40 years, 30 years. So this is completely possible. So in that sense, the Belt and Road is empowering Africa already now into the path of industrialization and development. But what is needed, China alone cannot do that. We need other nations in Europe, industrial nations with high levels of technology, and the United States to work together. This also will help ease the tension, geopolitical tension between the East and West. If China, Russia, the US, and Europe can work together in Africa, this would be a fantastic alternative to the Cold War developing now, which can turn into a real hot war, as many people predict. So this is really a dream, but it's quite achievable, it's applicable. And it's good that the African nations, African leaders also have that vision, like in the Agenda 2063. Many of these goals should have been reached. And as I said, Africa has certain resources. Africa only needs the tools to achieve its dreams. But it's very important for Africans today to have a vision of the future. I'm not African. I'm not intending to impose my vision on Africans, but from my understanding of how development had worked and comparing the colonial system to other systems, really revolutionary systems, like the United States was at one point, I think this is the right path to go. It's up to Africans, especially African young people, to chart their path to development, but also very useful to learn from other peoples and other nations. So I stop here, and I hope I have conveyed a certain idea, but I'm willing to answer questions now.
Thank you very much, Hussein. I can see that actually the opportunities are here. It looks like there is efforts to be done, but the opportunities are brought to us, and there are actually plans. There are things that are maybe only on paper, but it means that can happen. And it's not something that we need to build up from zero. It's something that we need to follow up and make it happening with cooperation, international cooperation. I can see that we have one question from Ufer. He was talking about especially the African Union. He said the African Union has the same, do you think the African Union has the same importance as the EU in Europe? And what does it mean for Africa to get a member of UN Security Council and meaning of UN in general in Africa?
Okay, I'll just stop the sharing so I can see everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's a big difference between the European Union and the African Union. The European Union was built as a, some sort of an imperial force in an insecure world. So the problem is that what the European Union did, it stripped its member states of their sovereignty, their ability to manage their economic and social and foreign policy issues. So they wanted to create one uniform African Union for countries with very, very different economic, social, and cultural backgrounds, different levels of development. So they tried to force a leveling of everything, which has put, for example, the less developed countries in Southern Europe into big, big trouble, and imposing austerity on these nations to manage the so-called fiscal discipline in the European Union. So many nations were unable to invest in their infrastructure because that was not allowed. They were not allowed to create a deficit to invest in very, very necessary infrastructure. So they put a set of rules imposed on European nations similar to the rules imposed by the IMF and World Bank on developing nations. So they were stripping themselves of the ability to develop. So this is a very big problem. You cannot force nations with different economic and social and cultural systems into one union and impose the same rules on everyone. It doesn't work. You cannot have, like for example, you cannot have as they tried to do with Ukraine, to have a EU-Ukraine free trade policy where the Ukrainian industry has to compete with the German industry. There's no way Ukraine can compete with German industry. So what they will have to do is to shut down their own industry because it's not competitive. In Africa, you have a different situation because you have countries of very close historical, cultural, economic identity, which is easier for them to work. But I don't think African nations should abandon their sovereignty. Each African nation also have to protect its own sovereignty, but work with its neighbors on a goodwill basis, because also physically they have to be connected. So there's no problem doing that. But each nation has to decide its own policy. If you look at China, yes, China works with the African Union, but when it comes to economic projects, they work only with sovereign governments. So they don't work with African Union as a big imperial power or something. They work with Tanzania, with Kenya, with Ethiopia, with Nigeria as sovereign nations. And this is a very important principle in international relations.
Thank you. We have a question from Mathieu. So Mathieu is a Hong Kongese French friend also. He is developing solar energy in Africa, actually. He has a lot of projects and he got even investment in China and in Africa. And yeah, he's very, very active as an entrepreneur between China and Africa. And he would love to know, he said, currently manufacturing is only 1.5% of Africa. What are the reasons holding back the industrialization of Africa and how this situation will evolve?
Yes, some of the reasons I already discussed, because you have the lack of infrastructure. If you don't have transport, cheap energy, and skilled labor, it's very difficult to have an industry. That's very, very basic issue. Also, even when it comes to agriculture, there was this big myth, which I discuss in that the Chinese brought 1 million farmers to Africa, and they were taking over African land to do agriculture. The thing is that the Chinese actually went to Africa in the 90s to explore the possibility of growing food and stuff there. And they signed many contracts, but then when they came to the actual land, they saw that there was no transport systems, there are no irrigation systems, and the farmers were not educated. So they packed and went home. They said, you cannot have modern agriculture, commercial agriculture if you don't have infrastructure and skilled labor and electricity and irrigation system. So the same thing goes for the industrial production. Now Ethiopia is industrializing quickly now because they both are building the infrastructure. They get the materials in and out of the country quicker. They are generating large amounts of power, and they will do in the hydropower sector. And they are building these industrial zones with training for the labor. And therefore the productivity in Ethiopia is exploding. And also thanks to investments from China. So of course you need foreign investment too, in addition to these elements, to make industrialization possible.
Thank you. We have a question from Han. And of course, guys, if you want to speak out by yourself, you can just unmute yourself, or no problem, I will ask a question for you. So as Chinese economy is hit hard by the epidemic, are there impacts on BRI projects in Africa? And can African countries continue with their development plans and vision?
Yes, I don't think the Chinese cooperation with Africa is based on short-term, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis. China has long-term economic cooperation plans with Africa, and I think these will continue. As I said, China does not want to be completely dependent on the United States and Europe as a market and as a trade partner. They need to develop Africa and Asia as the future market. So I think Chinese plans will continue. Of course, the collapse of the supply chains and all these things had a certain effect. But the Chinese are now restarting their economy with high speed. Of course, if they don't find the investments outside, they will focus on even more modernizing their own infrastructure, their own industrial capacity. But I don't think this will, on the long term, will affect African development. That African nations have to have a vision of what they want to do, each nation, and then work with others, not only China, work with others to implement these visions. So there will be short-term effects, of course, of the coronavirus outbreak, but I don't think they will last.
Thank you. So Charles is asking a question. He said, with regards to the no string attached, what do you think about the debt trap diplomacy that you've mentioned, and how do you reconcile them?
Okay, the Nord Stream, is that the gas pipeline, or can I answer?
I guess he's talking about the credits that we do have when we work with China, but I'm not sure. Maybe Charles wants to speak out.
Yes. I can answer on it.
Hello?
Okay, go ahead, Charles.
Yes, Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to Chinese vendors in our spring touch. We can send the book, this one.
Sorry, we cannot hear.
Can you write it?
Write in the chat.
I can answer the part on the credit and debt trap. I mean, I mentioned this in the book on the. In this book, I mentioned the question of the financing and all the myths, but then we have written extensively on the debt trap. This is a creation of think tanks. It has very little to do with reality. And every time you hear the debt trap, everybody's talking about the port in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port, which after the Sri Lankan government could not pay the debt, they signed an agreement with China to lease it for 90 years. Now, nobody can come up with any other example, but even the Hambantota port, this is potentially one of the most important ports in the Indian Ocean. And the Chinese are investing even more around that port, and it will become an industrial zone. So I looked at several case studies. Now, I mentioned studies done by the Asian Studies School of Asian Studies in Johns Hopkins University. It's an American research center. And they calculated for Africa is that actually most of the African debt, and we know this for the fact at the Schiller Institute, that it has been accumulated through policies of the IMF and the World Bank. Most of African debt is owed to multilateral finance institutions, IMF and World Bank, and also the Paris Club. And nations are forced to borrow money at higher interest rates to pay the old debt. So they are in a real debt trap. I studied the Pakistan case. I have an article, I can give you the link. I studied the Pakistan situation, and I found out that 90% of Africa's debt is owed to the Paris Club, IMF, and Pakistan was borrowing more money to pay the debt, but also they were borrowing $14 billion a month, which is half of the trade deficit, to buy oil and gas to generate electricity for Pakistan. So they were borrowing from British and other banks to buy oil and gas to burn it for electricity for $20 billion, which is 2 years imports of, less than 2 years import of oil and gas. China is building power plants for Africa, will generate power for 50 years. So imagine how much money Pakistan saves every year by generating the power at home. And then, not only generating power, they will restart their industries, because most of their industries were closed because of the lack of electricity. So now Pakistan not only will have not to pay for imported electricity, they will now restart their industries and increase the productivity of the economy and repay the old debt to the Western countries. But also they will be able to pay the debt of investment to China. Many of the Chinese projects in Pakistan are not done by loans. These are foreign direct investment, like the power plants. Chinese company build it with their own money. Pakistan only gives a guarantee that the money. But this is what I don't really like about some of these projects, is that they are done like so-called PPP, because the Pakistanis will have to buy the electricity from the Chinese companies for many years to repay the investment. It would have been better if Pakistan takes a loan from the Chinese Export-Import Bank and then produce the electricity and pay back the loan over 25, 30 years. But the Chinese are doing what the West is doing to avoid the criticism. They say, okay, you don't want loans, then we will invest in building the power plants ourselves, but we will have to sell the power so we get back our investment money. The Chinese, and this is not charity, the Chinese companies have a demand on them to make profit. If it's not profitable project, they will not do it. So the Chinese, this is what this win-win is about. It's just not to benefit Pakistan. Pakistan is an important strategic partner, but it's important for the Chinese companies too. It's also important strategically for China to have a corridor to the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean by land from west of China. So in all case studies of this debt trap, there is nothing true about it. What is true is that the Western countries have set the debt trap for Africa, South America, and Asian nations. And that can be proven, unlike the Chinese debt trap.
Thank you. So, Mr. JX, if you can take the floor, or maybe you prefer I ask a question for you. Okay, I think I will ask a question then. Oh, you, Amori, yes, go ahead.
Can I finish, or should I start? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So I'd like to ask, as concept change and integration are some of the Belt and Road Initiative objectives, are there any commissions that's going to help?
Can you speak louder? I'm sorry. Can you speak louder?
Yeah.
I didn't hear.
So as a culture exchange and integration are some of the Belt and Road Initiative objectives, are there any commission that's going to help the private sector in Africa, like from Africa, to have a better understanding why they should participate in Belt&Road initiative?
Yeah, you meant cultural exchange and yeah.
Yeah, cultural exchange and integration,
Information.
of course.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important that people in Africa get a clear picture of what the Belt and Road is about.
Right.
I think the Chinese need to do a better job in conveying that. The Chinese are focused on building the project. They are not, unlike what the Western media says, they're doing a lot of propaganda.
Right.
They are very bad at propaganda, actually. They are much better in building railways but the Chinese have they are very, very careful about cultural differences, about sovereignty of nations. Here in the West, we are very free to criticize any culture, any political system other than ours. We are not criticizing, but we interfere in other nations' internal matters, how they treat their people, how they eat, how they do things. The Chinese are very, very careful. They don't want to interfere in other countries' affairs, as they don't want anybody to interfere in their own affairs. That reflects into the lack of activity concerning conveying your own culture to others, or conveying your own ideas, political or philosophical ideas. They have been trying very hard in Europe and the United States through the Confucius Institutes, but everybody in the West is saying these Confucius Institutes is just a trick. They want to convert people to communism, and so most of the Confucius Institutes are closed. But I think it's very important, and I think Isabel is doing a good job, that especially young people, through activities of the young people, to create certain centers of information and try to get support from their own African nations, but also from China, to activate this kind of information, cultural exchange between people, people to people. This is part of the Belt and Road. They call it people to people exchanges. And organizations like yours, Isabel, and your members, they have to explore the possibilities of having this kind of activity, student exchanges, cultural exchanges, so that can help people, especially with the universities, to get the right information on all these things. Because as an African ambassador told me, he said, Hussein, you should come to our country and speak at the universities, because our young people, they listen to BBC and CNN, and everything about China is bad. So they need someone else with a different voice to speak. So I think it's very important.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I can see that Colin's raised hand, but
Yes.
first,
Yes.
let's first ask the question of JX, because
Can I go now?
Okay, let's go. As you are here, and later I will ask the written question. So let's say that the one who wants to talk, they can come after, and if there is no one to come for her, I will just say the questions. So go forward.
Ready. Hello.
Yes, Colin, we hear you. You can go. You can say your question. Okay, maybe
I'm hearing you. Yes.
I don't hear you correctly.
Can you hear me better now?
Oh, now it's fine. Now it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Right, my question is basically about the Belt and Road. Fantastic information here. I mean, I personally haven't been able to understand or have a full grasp of what the Belt and Road, the Silk Road, is all about. But I only know that there are about 46 European nations and, of course, over 100 African countries involved in the Belt and Road. But that's about what we know about it. Only for me to, in this conference, I'm hearing that there could be cultural exchanges. I personally, I lived in China, I lived in Beijing, I went to school in Beijing. I speak the language, I understand the Chinese culture. But that's like 0.1%
of Africans like myself. I mean, 0.01% of Africans are like myself that understand the Chinese culture, the Chinese business culture, and the Chinese language. But here is a very good opportunity for China to rebrand their information mechanism and systems, like Mr. Hussein has been talking about. There is a very huge deficit, a very huge gap in China, Africa, especially China, Africa, cultural exchange, information exchange. I mean, lately I've gone around Nigerian universities and I've noticed a few Nigerian universities that have started to have Confucius Institute, but that's just in the past maybe 4 years or 5 years they started to have Confucius Institute. And as far as I'm concerned, the Confucius Institute is about the only or the most important, the most popular cultural or academic institution that makes a doorway between Africa and China. And to me, that's very, very, very low, very poor, very inadequate. Recently, let me just digress a little bit with what has happened in Guangzhou with the Africans, Nigerians especially, and other Africans right there in China. It behoves on China to rejig the economic and cultural, not only economic, but cultural and cultural institutions between Africa and China. And just last week, I remember I was having this conversation during the COVID, which has brought about a lot of challenges. And we can see all the gaps and deficits, especially cultural gaps and deficits around the world. And we are thinking that it is time to have a cultural exchange between Africa, China, and Europe, where the young people of Africa, because when you talk about Africa, you have to bear in mind that you are also addressing the African diaspora, which has a population of about 300 plus million Africans all over the world, in the rest of the world. So these are all the people that China has owes a duty to explain what the Chinese culture is all about. So I am saying that, I am only asking a question, but also, I'm not only asking a question, but I'm also making a suggestion that we are here. We have watched developments between China and Africa in the mainstream. We've also watched development between China and Africa during the COVID, right inside the COVID, because for your information, there are 5,000 plus African students who were trapped in Wuhan, China, the original epicenter. And our organization has been in contact with other Africans, over 80,000 Africans across China right now studying as students. So this is a huge window of opportunity for China to have their cultures translated to Africa, the language, the culture, the food, and tourism. So we are saying in solidarity that we want to support China in Africa to take the message of Chinese culture and exchanges between Africa, China, and Europe, which I think is fundamental in fostering peace and cooperation around the world.
Thank you, Colin. We will let a bit of more time for others also for questions. And yes, agree. And that's what we try to do now by doing those events and reunited people from everywhere in the world, because it just takes all of us to understand each other and to work together to make it happen. That's also the idea behind Teranga Valley. And we would be very glad to work with you maybe in a cultural event that we could put together with your community as well of students in China.
We have two guests who we have Andrew from the African diaspora in Europe, but you can say something about that. But also we have from China, I see among our guests is Mrs. Liu Jian. She has been active also in exchanges among youth, but mostly between Europe and China. And I don't know if she has something to comment on this question of China, Africa.
Sure, if she could, yes. You can unmute yourself if you want to add something, Madam.
Yeah. I just before this New Year last year at December, I was in Africa for the first time.
Sorry, can you identify your organization, or if you want to?
I'm the co-founder of Yichi Foundation, and we are mainly working on young people, to bring people, young people together to boost the mutual understanding. Yeah, so yeah, I saw during my work, I've visited mainly between China and Europe. Many times I've been in Europe. I met friends in Europe. I really saw that the European people in Europe, they have so little knowledge about China. And I have one story that in Geneva we met a musician couple. They somehow we had a talk, and they were so they said during that time they were at the medias, mainstream medias. There were so much articles about China invasion, culture invasion, or something like that to Europe, and they got so afraid of that. And then we had a talk, and I explained a little bit the basic thinking of Chinese culture, and then they said, "Oh my God, why we don't know this? You should come and tell us." I said we were trying, but we are trying, but that needs time. So
you said you were about to tell us about your visit to Africa last year.
Yeah, last year, yeah, that's really. I saw so many. We had a trip to Africa in Kenya, Kisumu, and the capital city. So we saw so many clever young people in Africa, so many, but they really lack basic conditions to develop. And they have huge land, huge resources, huge clever people. So but the situation was so terrible, I must say, and so sad to say that. And we were there to we co-organized a seminar about young entrepreneurship and innovation, and we saw that the so-called what they need, the most important thing what they need now is infrastructure. So that's what I have seen there. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, and I would be very glad to connect with you because yes, we are working on that, and that's why we do those events. We want to have more understanding, because I also live in China, and I love the Chinese culture, I love my culture, and I love learning about everyone else's culture, and it's so rich. And as you said, you just need to let people meet each other, then the magic happens, because he saw so many things right on the TV, but the second you explain him one thing, it's over. He got over it, right? So there is some magic about meeting and doing events and gathering people, because things will happen naturally, because people actually, they want connection. They just don't know each other. And when you put them together, that's something magical is happening. So I would be very glad that our community can help as well to make this happen with yours, and maybe Colin also. I think there is a good potential here. Please add me on WeChat if you're not yet connected. Thank you for your intervention. Maybe some last questions. Like we had a question from JX. Yes, he said, thank you, Hussein. And what would be the top 5 African countries that have the best growth potential for China?
Sorry, once again.
So he asked, what would be the top 5 African countries that have the best potential for China, according to you? Top 5.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, on the question of the youth, my friend Michel reminded me that we have in the Schiller Institute now an initiative to bring together young people, create a youth movement from every country in the world. So all the young people here can actually join. There are conference calls like this one, but they are arranged with the young people. So I can provide you with the connection to that. Concerning which African countries are most potentially of interest for China, in my view, well, it's a bit difficult because what I would look at is not, because you have countries that have a great, I mean, you have like Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, now Kenya, for example. Just take a few examples. These are very large countries. Some of them have a relatively more developed skilled labor. So for example, building industrial zones, which is, I think it's a new Chinese strategy, is rather than producing everything, all the simple commodities in the world, you know, clothing, electronics, toys, footballs, it's no longer profitable for Chinese workers to produce these simple things for Africans or for Europeans. So their idea, as President Xi Jinping, he said, we will move from quantity to quality. So what I translate that in terms of foreign trade is that instead of producing all these simple commodities that are have very little value, but they are necessary in other countries, China will export the factories and technology which will produce them to those countries so they can produce their own materials, consumption goods. So China will increase the value of its products by building industrial complexes, machines, and so on, and sell it to those countries at much, much higher value than exporting small commodities. And the African countries who will be first to start there, they will be the most competitive, like Ethiopia. They're working very hard to become the center for, you know, Chinese developed industrial zones for exports. Egypt, they are building also near the Suez Canal. They have in Morocco. Nigeria is a huge country, a huge market, and has so-called financial potential because of the oil exports. But as we discussed, that's no guarantee that you are a rich country if you have a lot of oil when the oil price collapses. So this is in terms of profitability right now, but I think the most interesting countries are the countries who don't have any of that. Like in the Great Lakes region. I mean, Rwanda is being explained internationally as the big. I still have to see what kind of infrastructure and energy consumption, and if there's any industry in Rwanda, or is this just a nice image? So it's very important that we don't look only for profitability in the short term, but we look for the long-term processes. Because you will have key countries like in the Great Lakes who connect East and West. You have the Eastern Congo region, you have the Central African Republic. You know, the countries will become hubs for the East, West, North, South African communication. I think these countries will be very, very important. But they also have very huge natural resources, a lot of water, also more population dense regions. These would be the most interesting regions for China in the future, not immediately.
Thank you. And of course, Senegal. I'm just
Hello.
kidding. So yes, you can
Yes.
go ahead. You can go ahead.
No, I think there are countries who can create
Surprise.
an edge, a niche where they can become the best in Africa in specific areas. And that is, a lot is based on the innovation capability. So some countries might be small or have little natural resources, but then they can develop very high technologies and become leading in producing these technologies more efficiently, higher quality, and cheaper prices. So it's no guarantee, as I said, if you are a big country, you have a lot of natural resources, it's no guarantee that you'll be the most advanced country. Could be the opposite, like in Japan.
Okay, maybe a last question, because we are on the time now. So William,
Hello?
would you like to ask a question? Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Thank you again, Mr. Hussein. You raised some very important points that kind of made me think about my experiences here in China. First of all, I came from a HBCU, which is a historic Black college and university in the U.S. And it's only one of 4 institutions in the U.S. that has a Confucius Institute. So I actually participated in some of the Confucius Institute's program back in the U.S. So I understood when you started talking about that component. And another part was that when you started talking about the youth development, I recently took a trip to Ghana during the year of return. And I witnessed the potential there and for the youth and talking to a lot of people. And there's a big disparity between what they know how to do. They have the ambitions and the drive to do a lot of things, but it's just the practical experience that they lack on how to develop their business and things in that direction. And also you mentioned about the BRI, about the World Bank and IMF. What I'm getting at, with all these questions I'm getting at, what I see that, what I'm hearing you is that the same thing that is happening in Black America is the same thing that's happening in Africa. In aspect, if you really look at Black America, there are some communities in America that lack quality healthcare, that lack affordable housing, that lack of adequate water supply and things of that nature. You're talking about in a developed country. So what I'm saying in an aspect, and the other gentleman that spoke about Africa, oh, am I gone? Africa, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Hello? Okay, the other gentleman talking about Africa, China, and Europe. I've always had this concept in my mind that if Black America and got involved with more with the BRI or more with trade relationship with China, that would overtly lead to a better relationship, trade relationship with Africa. I think the reason that all of this is happening with Black and Africa's development from Europe and from the United States is based on race. And that's why they're having so much problem dealing with China. That is my honest opinion as a Black man from America who's been around for quite some time. I think the underlying issue of all of this development with Africa, with China, is based on race. That the United States and Europe does not want other people to seem better than them because the world is changing and going in that direction. That's my honest opinion.
Okay.
What do you say about that?
Yeah, that's fine. As I said, it's very, very important for the United States to participate in the Belt and Road in developing Africa, not only because President Roosevelt had that dream, but as you mentioned, I mean, our friends in the Schiller Institute have made studies on the conditions of infrastructure, social, health conditions of the American people. And what you say about that is completely correct. I mean, our friends in the United States just produced a report on how to create globally 1.5 billion productive jobs and around 50 million productive jobs in the United States. And I think one of the authors of that report is just joined us, Jason Ross, if he can say something about that. But it's very important for Europe and the United States, for their own sake, to save their own economies and to get, and you know, reduce the enormous social thing. I can't make a general statement on racism. What I did is to show that there's an attitude in Europe, and I guess somewhere in the United States, towards Africa, which goes back to the colonial mentality. Now, you call it racist. It's, for me, I can't say that it's a racist policy. It could be racist policy. You know, we've been talking about technological apartheid, because we have people in Europe who say Africa should have so-called adjusted technology, which means no nuclear power, no hydropower, no advanced technology, just African technology, you know, which is nothing that we have in Europe. And they don't realize that this is conceived as racist. Many people who say these things, they don't even hear themselves that they sound a bit racist, where they say Africa should not have these. You cannot trust Africans to have nuclear power or modern technology or this and that. So there is a real problem. I understand you. We see this as in the United States as a rampant. The Black Americans are the most oppressed economically, socially in the United States. There is no, it's not a secret. We see the effects of it the whole time. But I think it's to go out in a spirit of goodwill to all people. There's a philosophical problem, because in the colonial system is based on a bestial philosophy, what we call the Thomas Hobbes philosophy, that human nature, every human will do their best to get everything for themselves. It's greed which is our motivation, not doing good in the world. And therefore, for individuals and also nations, we are all at war against all. So if we are egoistic, we do the best for ourselves by undermining the others. Now, this is not how humanity has developed so far. Yes, we had empires who had that mentality, but they usually lead to destruction of others and themselves. But we also had a philosophy in the world which was going in the opposite direction. Otherwise, humanity would never have managed to come so far. We would have vanished long time ago. That we are good. We do things for the good reason, not only for egoistic reasons. And our creativity is our most important source. And to develop our own creativity in scientific, cultural, and other means is our best tool to develop ourselves and others, not stealing from others, not raping other countries. This is really not how America or Europe became rich. I'm sorry, it's not by looting gold from South America or taking raw materials from Africa that Europe became rich. Yes, specific institutions, financial and economic institutions, became very, very rich from these looting and from the opium wars against China. But the United States and Europe's industrial development was the key factor in the modernization of these countries. But things shift up and down. The attitude towards Africa is immoral, and in many cases it's criminal. And that's why the Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche, she's German, she's the head of the Schiller Institute, she said the development of Africa is our moral, it's a test for our morals, not simply for our skills or anything. So therefore, the development of Africa is not simply a technical thing, but it could become the moral reawakening of all governments in the West, especially, to clean the colonial past and chart a new path for relations among nations. I think if you listen to the Chinese and Chinese president, they say this very, very clearly. This is the kind of governance they're talking about. And we have in the Western culture, we had in Europe 130 years of religious wars. Almost half of the, between 1400 and 48, we had 30 years of religious wars where people were slaughtered en masse in Europe, in the European cities. Half of the German population was finished. And then some wise people came, said, look, if we continue like this, everybody's gonna die. So we have to have a new way of looking at each other as neighbors. And therefore we had what's called the Peace of Westphalia, where the European powers decided that nobody interferes in the affairs of the others. Their religion, their economic affairs, that's their own business. We have to respect sovereignty. But they added that each nation should work for the benefit of the other. Now this was completely new. Even today, people would laugh at you if you say the United States should work for the benefit of China. So that was a new principle which came in, which is part of the United Nations Charter, the sovereignty and independence of nations, but nations should work together for the benefit of each other in a spirit of goodwill. And I think the Belt and Road is a fantastic translation of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hussein. So I will just say that I've also been invited to the youth conference with Helga. And I will share with the group as well for the next one. So people who are interested in getting into this youth, let's say, engagement about trying to changing things and thinking right for ourselves. I will also share the links when we will have I will have this next event by Helga. And as well, I want to say that the links to your books, if you can share with me later, I will also give in the different groups that we have. So don't hesitate to add us on WeChat and WhatsApp. For the questions that we could not answer, I will send them over to you, Hussein, if you allow me, and just to give us a short answer that we will as well share in the group so people can have a little insight, because we don't have enough time today to review all the questions. Thank you so much. I was really, really glad to have you. It's really an honor. And I really hope that we can continue to contribute and see what we can do to lift up Africa, and as well uniting all the people working together, because at the end it's about humanity. It's about, you know, all of us living in a peaceful world where you are allowed to, you know, have the minimum, even the minimum, you know, to be happy, because that's the goal to everyone in the world. And I don't think it's utopic. I think it's so much in reach, but we just don't know where to start. And that's why we want to come here and we want to learn, we want to hear. And today you opened some perspective to us to know more, to reach for more, and trying to see how we can impact our continent. Thank you so much, Hussein.
Thank you very much. It was a great honor for me to be with this wonderful group of people. It's very unique.
Thank you. So feel free, guys, if you have to go, and thank you for staying until now. It's a bit late in China. We are very happy to meet new people. Thank you for the Schiller Institute. I see that many people from your institute as well joined this event. We are grateful for your support in our quest of learning more about Africa, China. And thank you for being a great resource for us to learn more about the BRI. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, guys.